From the Baker Institute for Public Policy, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ambassador David Satterfield. Baker Briefing tackles the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. Each episode is recorded in front of a live audience at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Today's alliterative topic, Tesla, taxes, and Texas. As increasing numbers of Texans, and I would project this more broadly throughout the United States, switch from gas to battery-powered vehicles, state policymakers here are grappling with short and long-term strategies to support increased electric vehicle EV ownership in Texas. So, Ed, let's set the stage. As these vehicles become more popular, and I understand about 5% of sales of passenger vehicles here are indeed EVs, why does this switch from gas-powered to electric-powered vehicles create policy issues?
Well, it's a simple answer. These are maintained by the fuel tax, and electric vehicles don't pay a fuel tax. Texas hasn't raised the gasoline tax or the fuel tax since 1991.
What is that tax then?
20 cents in Texas. Now, 1993 was the last time the federal government raised it, and they add 18.4 cents for gasoline and 24.4 cents for diesel. So the total tax in Texas is the combination of those two. And then along come electric vehicles, which tend to be heavier. They produce as much, if not more, wear on the roadways, and yet they're not paying anything toward the maintenance of the road. So what the legislature is grappling with now is, how do you get electric vehicles to pay their fair share?
How do you do that?
So there's a number of different ways that have been proposed. There's a couple of bills before the Texas legislature now. They would just increase the registration fee between $200 and $400 on electric vehicles. Other methods would be to start taxing mileage instead of having a fuels tax, actually tax the miles that people drive on the roads. But those are the two most popular methods put forth.
And just to interject, that $200 to $400 annual fee is an approximation of what a passenger vehicle is estimated in a rough fashion to pay in terms of gas or diesel taxes, correct?
In the course of a year.
In the course of a year.
And the vehicle miles tax, or VMT, is very popular because it makes so much sense. If you think, well, gosh, you go in and register your vehicle every year, check the odometer, check it at the end of the year, how many miles did you drive, put a tax on it. The problem with that is you don't know how many of those miles were inside the state of Texas versus outside the state. And that would cause it to be nationalized, and Texans flinch at that idea.
The other option would be to tax EV charging. So when you plug the car in, you could have a tax on how much you charge the car, which would be equivalent more to the gas tax instead of using a mileage tax.
But that's complicated, of course,
because
unlike gas or diesel, for most people, you don't have a pump in your garage at home, but you undoubtedly have a charging facility at home. And how do you access that? So, John, we talked about ways in which the state may look to compensate itself for the lack of the at-the-pump tax revenues for these new class of vehicles. Are there incentives out here in terms of tax policies? Does the state wish to encourage the further acquisition of electric-powered vehicles or not?
So there's incentives on both the state and federal level. The largest incentives are at the federal level currently. So for consumer cars, you can get a rebate of anywhere from $3,000 to $7,500. That's for new cars. And then there's a number of stipulations about the price of the car. The car has to be owned, it can't be leased. There's a weight categorization of the car. So you have a number of things that you have to qualify to get the maximum rebate or the maximum tax incentive. Also new from the infrastructure bill in 2021 was you can get a rebate on if you purchase a used EV with a tax credit of up to $4,000. So there's a number of credits for personal cars. There's also in the Infrastructure Act, they have credits for commercial vehicles. And there's also a program at the federal level to incentivize states and localities to move to electric school buses. So there's a number of tax incentives at the federal level for regular cars, commercial cars, and even school buses. And just, a school bus, a normal diesel school bus costs about $100,000. An electric school bus costs about $380,000. So there's a big difference. If you want school districts to buy electric school buses, you have to give them a fairly large incentive to do that. At the state level, there's also, so Texas has an alternative fuel tax credit. It's currently closed. I guess they gave out as much as they want to give out, and so they're not currently taking applications. I would say Texas is one of the least generous states in terms of credits for electric vehicles. States such as California, Florida, New York, New Jersey have much larger credits that they give at the state level, which is then in addition to the credits at the federal levels. There's a wide range of credits that are available to people buying electric vehicles at the current time.
Ed, what's your thoughts on the politics of all this? Here in Harris County, as well as in Texas?
Well, of course, Texas is an energy-rich state. We have an oil and gas history, so you've got that built-in bias. But the other thing about Texas and the electrification of vehicles, there are a lot of people looking at alternatives. Dr. Diamond mentioned school buses. A lot of those are already compressed natural gas. There's more CNG than LNG, but even that is available. And now there's a lot of conversation about renewable fuels. Former Finnish oil company Neste has already signed a contract, for example, with American Airlines. I know that's an airline, but the same principle applies, where they take the cooking grease from McDonald's and turn it into aviation fuel. Well, when it comes to over-the-road vehicles, particularly truckers, they're not going to want to give up their life savings that they've got tied up in their big rig when they can use a renewable fuel and put it in the internal combustion engine that they have. So I think Texas is always going to have a little bit of pushback against the electric vehicles, leaving all the politics aside, because let's face it, there are just some people, though, that look at anybody who drives an electric vehicle in Texas and says, well, you're not a real Texan. I'm not endorsing that position, but I'm just saying that you do see that. And I'll say we have a cabin up in East Texas near a little town called Romare. I have yet to see an electric vehicle in Romare, Texas.
In our conversation, Ed, before this briefing, you used an expression which I think is worth drawing attention to, which is finger on the scale. That there is at a national level an incentivization of battery-powered electric vehicle acquisition as if this was the end state of a transition away from hydrocarbon-powered personal and, it would appear, commercial or a significant portion of commercial vehicles. What does that do to incentivizing a broader transition, or transitions plural?
Well, I think you have a lot of people, when the government puts its thumb on the scale, it tilts it. But I don't pretend to be a scientist. But technology, I don't know many people who think electric vehicles are the final technology. I think they're looking more at hydrogen cell vehicles, renewable fuels, any number of other things. And so if the government is giving all these incentives to electric vehicles, they're going, well, what about us? Why don't we get those same incentives? So I think you're going to see more and more of that. And ultimately, whenever the government starts putting their thumb on the scale, then they start playing with the market. And the market probably would come up with a different answer than electric vehicles.
And that was the question, John, I was about to address to you. When we, as we talk about a lot here at the Institute, discuss the impact of federal government statements from Washington on the hydrocarbon industry, whichever direction that statement on any given day or hour of the day happens to go. And we counter by saying, it's the markets, not government declarations, that really drive things. It's investments, it's investors, it's the big financial holders of equities that will drive corporate decisions. Talk to us about the electric vehicle industry. To what extent is it the same issue? The government can put its finger on the scale, but markets are going to be shaped by factors about investment, return, viability. What do the markets think of all this?
Yeah, I think the markets are affected in the sense that it may push them off course for a bit. But ultimately, you hope that the technology that will produce the largest gains in living standards will come through eventually. And so the analogy would be in communication devices. In the late 90s, the big push was for fiber optics. We spent billions laying fiber optic cables trying to get everyone access, only then to realize that, we were able to put up low-flying satellite, which made all of that fiber optic cable just useless. So could something like that happen with electric cars? Absolutely. And so I think we need to be careful as we move forward. You can spend a bunch of money inefficiently. The difference is this is related to this other crisis we face. And so we're trying to do something quickly, and so the government's trying to act now, and it can't wait for the market to make up its mind on which technology is going to be dominant, say 10 years from now. So in a sense, we're forced to just kind of do what we're doing. The market will ultimately decide, though.
But you might be left with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Betamax when it's all gone to VHS.
Correct. That's a problem.
And I've still got VHS that went somewhere else.
We're going to skip this discussion, but
That's a different, well, let me add one other, there's another piece here. Think of all the fueling stations we have, gasoline stations in the state of Texas. You've got a vested interest there all over the state, all over the country. And suddenly if we go electric, well, what happens to them? They go out of business? Or if there's a renewable fuel that they can put in those same tanks and serve through the same system that they do now, is that going to be more acceptable? And I think the lobby of that group is going to be very interesting.
well, here we get into a real question about government policies and regulations. It is fine as declaratory policy in the state of California to say all vehicles sold must be an alternative energy powered vehicle by a year given. But what do you do about the existing massive fleet of gas, of diesel, of LNG and CNG powered vehicles who will still require servicing? You're talking about laying on effectively a new layer of electric vehicle support without being able to eliminate your pre-existing structures unless you attempt to outlaw the use of hydrocarbon-powered vehicles. And even for the state of California, that is a powerful reach to try to make. So there is a real dilemma here in which you can have two technologies existing, two support structures at the same time, in the best of worlds, as opposed to an inadequate support for EVs with continued support for hydrocarbons, which is probably a more likely near-term outcome.
While that sounds inefficient when you state it, we may need a long transition time because we may have to run two parallel systems, not only because it's going to take a while for the stock of cars to shift over to electric cars, but also, remember, 2 years ago, we all had no electricity as we tried in the middle of February as we had a big freeze. And shifting every car onto the grid right now is really infeasible. And that's another problem. I mean, all of this discussion about the gas tax and using it to pay for roadways, where we still have 4 or 5 other issues out there that are very large. How many charging stations are we going to need? Can our grid maintain and charge all of those cars on the electric side? But then we still have water issues, flood issues, and other infrastructure issues that we have to address. So a slow transition may be the best we can do, given the lack of resources we have.
And a slow transition would allow the rationality, and they are rational over time, of markets in the marketplace to sort out these various issues, whichever way it takes it.
I remember a few years ago when compressed natural gas, CNG, people thought Texas has lots of gas, it's going to be wonderful. But the fueling system never really developed. If you had a CNG vehicle, where do you go get the CNG? Who's going to develop the electric recharging stations? Are those going to be like gas stations? Is the state going to do it? How's that going to work? And then the other thing that I have to throw into this conversation, just talking to lobbyists around the country and seeing what they're doing, the bitter fight is actually between people on the environmental side. You've got the people who want EVs versus the people who want renewables. And every time there's a piece of legislation, they're grinding against each other as much as they're grinding against the outside world. It's going to be interesting to see who wins.
Because while this isn't the primary topic of this discussion, there are major sustainability, environmental, and carbon signature impacts of electronic vehicles. The batteries, the rare earths that go into them, the disposal factor, all of these are profound and may well be, over time, limiting factors on the ultimate elasticity of the market for EVs. As you look at states outside of Texas, and I'll start with you, Ed, what are other states doing in grappling with the kinds of questions we've been raising here?
Well, of course, set California aside because they kind of lead in their own way. And they're already talking about banning hydrocarbons, but at first they were talking about banning the internal combustion engine. And that caused the renewable people to go, well, wait a minute. We don't pollute, and it's still renewable. I think other states are grappling with the same thing we are in terms of finance. How do you tax vehicles that don't pay a fuels tax? The fuels tax in Texas went in 1923. So it's been here for 100 years, and that's probably the way every state has done it. So now they're trying to figure out, okay, what do we do next? And how do you get the EVs? And I think probably, my guess is, if you didn't ask, my guess is they're going to first all start passing a bill that puts an extra registration fee on electric vehicles. It's the simplest, it's the neatest. It may not be exactly fair. You may see in some states bringing politics into it. They may say, you know what? People that can afford an electric vehicle can afford to pay a little bit more. And so I think it may be even an upcharge.
John?
One thing great about the U.S. is our states are laboratories for different policies. And so I think we will see some states play around with the idea of taxing miles driven as opposed to a gas tax. To double back on what Ed said, this isn't really a new problem. Even before electric vehicles, we were struggling with the problem that cars were becoming more and more fuel efficient, which was decreasing revenues. And then we hit COVID, and now people work from home 2 to 3 days a week, which reduces miles driven. So there's kind of been 2 or 3 things that have happened. I think we'll definitely have a registration fee, but the one thing we know is states are going to have to fund roadways. And they almost all use gas taxes to do it, and they're almost all running short. So changes are coming.
And what are we going to expect as Texans out of this legislative session? The fee?
There's 2 bills with the fee in it. I don't think either has the political support to pass at this time. I could be wrong there. So I don't expect anything this session to really change in terms of EVs for the state of Texas. I think we're focused on a number of other issues right now.
Which we don't want to talk about. But, but I will say they might do a fee. They might. But longer term, the legislature loves interim studies. So there will no doubt be an interim study on this. And part of that interim study, I've already been told, will be VMT, vehicle miles traveled, how to make that work. And so they may decide, you know, John may well be right, they may decide, okay, we're not going to do it this session. The other thing I have to say about Texas, Prop 7 passed a few years ago, and Texas takes, what is it, $2.5 billion, I think that number's right, out of general revenue and puts it into the highway fund. Texas can afford to do that. How many states have a $33 billion surplus to play with? So Texas is going to be a little different.
Well, at the end of the day, the books have got to balance, and the cost of maintaining infrastructure, even if it's just highway infrastructure as opposed to all of the other sectors that here in Texas nationwide need addressal, it's going to have to be met with funding from somewhere. And if it's not coming out of fuel pump taxes, it's got to come from some other place. And that can only be put off for so long as the share of EVs continues to increase. And my assumption is that 5% is today, but if you looked at where it was a few years ago, it would be nowhere close to that, and it won't be close to it a few years from now.
The one thing we did not talk about are tolls. Years ago, conservatives tolls were wonderful because it was a user fee. But the conservatives leading the Texas legislature right now don't like tolls at all. So that's always an alternative out there, but I don't see that coming to the fore anytime soon.
Very good. Gentlemen, a topic for further discussion. Thank you all. The Baker Institute provides meaningful policy analyses on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. This episode was produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production was provided by Kevin Young. Many thanks to the Baker Institute interns who assisted with this episode: Maya Adekare, Sarah Davidson, and Lisa Jacob. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording on the campus of Rice University, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for listening.